Ole Miss at South Carolina. It's a showdown. It's an SEC showdown at Williams-Brice. 3:30 p.m. Eastern on Saturday. Ole Miss is a 9-point favorite in this one. Over-under is set at 52.5. Obviously, Ole Miss coming off the big loss last week at home to Kentucky. South Carolina has got the one loss this season to LSU, a controversial loss at that. A game that South Carolina had chances to win, no doubt about it. It's really kind of wild how the football world works. But Ole Miss, or excuse me, South Carolina and Kentucky are so very similar, it's not even funny. And now Ole Miss gets Kentucky last week at home, loses that football game, and then they got to go on the road to a hostile environment here. And believe me, South Carolina is a hostile environment, and they've got to go play the carbon copy of the team that they just played. So Ole Miss has got a chance here to prove that what happened last week was a fluke. Now, as somebody who loves to watch college football and watches an embarrassing amount of it, I'm going to tell you right now, I've watched enough Kentucky to understand that they've got a good defense. And Ole Miss ran into a bit of a buzzsaw, and maybe they were overlooking Kentucky a little bit, but I don't know how that would necessarily be possible after you just saw Kentucky do what they did to Georgia's offense a few weeks ago. And lo and behold, it ended up costing Ole Miss. Let's talk about Ole Miss. We'll talk about South Carolina here after we get done with Ole Miss. Let's just kind of go through our. This is our first Ole Miss breakdown this season, isn't it, Mason? Because
Yeah,
they
I think
haven't
it
played
is.
anybody yet. So,
Yeah.
Ole Miss fans, thank you for watching. I hope you'll consider hitting the subscribe button. It's okay. Luckily, we're in a 12-team playoff era. The loss last week doesn't mean a damn thing here at the end of the season if you do your business here the rest of the way. So, welcome to the First and Long College Football Show. Come and join us. Let's talk some Ole Miss football here in this one. Jackson Dart, Heisman guy so far this season, right? Certainly a guy that would, if the season ended now, would be invited to New York and I think would stand a really, really good chance of winning that sucker. 77.4% completion, 1,815 yards. He's on pace to have his personal best season, and it's not even close. It's not even close. I was updating these numbers from this actual slide here from the 2023 stats that we did our preseason breakdown. He is on pace to like double a lot of his numbers. I mean, this guy is going to put up the stats, and that's what you would expect from a Lane Kiffin offense, no doubt. Jackson Dart is the real deal. I think these wide receivers again, the real deal. We've got one surprise in the room, Caden Lee here for Ole Miss's offense, and I'm gonna just sweep through Ole Miss's offense here, and then I'm gonna bring Mason in and get your thoughts in total on the offense, and we'll kind of talk a little more about what happened with Kentucky there. But Caden Lee, sophomore from Kennesaw, Georgia, a guy that you were not expecting to step up in this offense, has really done so this season, and it's been much invited. 16 receptions, 275 yards, a touchdown. But we all know the main attractions on this offense at this point. Trey Harris. Trey Harris, so far this season, we're going into week 6 of college football. We're doing week 6 previews and predictions, and he's already got 804 yards receiving. Unbelievable. He had just over 900 last year for the whole year. And I thought he had a good year last year. So this guy is on a record setting pace. I mean, he is literally, is 2,000 yards possible for Trey Harris? I think it certainly is if he can stay healthy. 5 touchdowns, 16.4 yards per reception. That number was just a tick down, but you just got to figure because he's already got 49 receptions, close, not far off from the amount of receptions he had last year. And Juice Wells comes over from South Carolina, kind of an underlying storyline here. Juice Wells is going to be making his return to South Carolina, and you better believe the Boo Birds will be out because South Carolina fans were not happy about Antoine Juice Wells leaving that program. 14 receptions, 274 yards this season. He's the third leading receiver, 4 touchdowns, kind of your a big target there, obviously, in the red zone and for going for 6 there. Really, really good wide receiver room. And, guys, there's guys behind these guys. There's tight ends behind these guys. They're the wide receiver room, the pass catchers room, however you want to label it, is fully loaded. This is the biggest issue about this offense to me, and one of the biggest things that I point to last week against Kentucky for that loss. Where's Ulysses S. Bentley, right? Or Ulysses Bentley or whatever. Uh, he has really been a disappointment this season. And after Quinshon Judkins left for Ohio State in the offseason, hit the transfer portal, we were a little bit worried because Bentley's never been a primary back in an offense. And so you go in and you get Henry Parrish over from Miami. He comes in and he's really been a godsend. 70 carries, 489 yards, 8 touchdowns this season. That's really good. 7.0 average, really good. Matt Jones has surprisingly been your second leading rusher this season, 33 carries, 209 yards, 3 touchdowns. This was a guy that was kind of just buried on the depth chart, and you just happened to kind of have him laying around. And it's worked out for the most part, but it really, I felt like kind of bit Ole Miss in the butt last week. Here's the offensive line group. You make of it what you want. There's a lot of transfers here. It seems like everything's working okay for this offensive line. Giving up some sacks this season, 10 sacks allowed. I think that's kind of the risk you run when you got a running quarterback, but not all of them were on runs. I mean, some of these were dropbacks where they're allowing sacks. So 10 is a high number, 89th in the country. And tackles for loss allowed, they've allowed 21 this season. That's good for 51st. And this is concerning for me in a sense, Mason, because, I mean, I haven't played a bunch of teams where you sit there and point at and say, you can understand why they'd give up sacks here. Look at that team. I mean, they haven't played anybody. Gave up 4 sacks last week to Kentucky, and don't look now, but you got South Carolina defensive line coming in. There's no rest for the weary. I mean, it's another group of killers coming in. But this is the offensive line group. They've been pretty decent, I guess, just decent for a mix and match mosh posh of guys coming from all over the country. These big transfer portal programs, you just never know how things are going to work out when you get everybody on campus. But it's been okay, not the strength of the offense. And like we said last week, Kentucky takes care of Ole Miss 20-17. Look at the stats from some of those from that football game, some of the offensive stats. Because look, I mean, we'll put the defense aside. They gave up a big play here and there to Kentucky. But when you give up 20 points, you should win a football game, right? When your defense holds somebody to 20 at home, you should win the football game. It really doesn't matter who you're playing. 92 yards rushing in that football game. That's not going to get it done. You're not able to sustain drives. And even more further proof of that, 1 for 10 on third down. When you can't run the ball and stay ahead of the sticks, you're not going to be good on third down. And this is what happens to a finesse offense sometimes, Mason. And I don't say it to be some kind of an insult to Ole Miss people. Look, I'm a UGA fan. I think UGA and Ole Miss offenses have some things in common in the fact that they're finesse. They're more finesse than they are physical. And a really, really physical team can kind of shake these teams off of their spot. We saw it happen to Georgia in the first half of the Alabama game. They were able to figure it out at halftime, but Georgia, it was really, really rocky on offense and really couldn't get anything going. I feel like that's kind of the trouble with these finicky, really fine-tuned Lamborghini-style offenses where one little thing's off and it can kind of throw a wrench in the gears. And 6.3 yards per play last week. That's not just running the football. That's passing, running, all that mixed together. That's not great. 4 sacks allowed. We talked about that. Turned the ball over in that football game. But did have 261 yards passing, and I would consider Kentucky's secondary to be pretty good. They were missing Hairston, one of their best cornerbacks, one of the better cornerbacks in the SEC. So take from that what you will. But all in all, it was the 261 yards passing were all for naught as Ole Miss lost that football game. All right. I just wanted to kind of set the table for kind of what my thoughts were on this offense. What do you think about this offense for Ole Miss headed into this matchup against South Carolina?
Well, I mean, I think you pretty much said it all, but I think Jackson Dart is first tier SEC quarterback, and he's got some of the best weapons at wide receiver and tight end. Plus, Parrish has been like a really bright spot in this offense and has really been one of the best running backs in the SEC so far. Although last week against Kentucky, we saw him go down a couple times with injury, and we really saw Ole Miss's depth get challenged. I'm questioning, his health going into this game. I think that could be a big concern going against this South Carolina defensive line. But ultimately, I mean, when you look at the game last week against Kentucky, I think what we saw was a Kentucky team that proved that their close game against Georgia was not a fluke. You know, they lost to Georgia by 1 point and played at almost the exact same game that they played against Ole Miss. The quarterback ran the ball pretty well, Vandegrift. They ran the ball pretty well on offense, and they really had these long, methodical drives that kept the ball out of Jackson Dark's hands on defense for Kentucky, and they kept their defense off the field, kept them fresh for the drives when Ole Miss had the football, and that was the recipe for beating Ole Miss. Can South Carolina do the same thing in this game to beat Ole Miss? That's a big question mark for me because so far South Carolina's offense has been a little bit more, touch and go. They've kind of sputtered at times, and they have had more explosive plays, whereas Kentucky's been driving the ball down the field, been very slow on offense. South Carolina hasn't really done it as well, I think, as Kentucky, but on the other side of the football, defensively, I think South Carolina is very similar to Kentucky, particularly on that defensive line. Ole Miss, we were talking about their offensive line. They really got challenged against Kentucky, and that's a really good pass rush for Kentucky. They gave up 4 sacks. I would argue that South Carolina is as good, if not better, than Kentucky on the defensive line. So that's not going to change in this football game. I still expect Ole Miss to give up about 4 sacks in this football game. But that's the weakest part on the offense is the offensive line for Ole Miss. So to me, looking at Ole Miss, I don't if Parrish isn't 100%, I don't know that Ole Miss can run the ball as well as they would like. So a lot is going to be on Jackson Dart, and really what they should really focus on is probably the middle of the field. And I think Caden Prescorn could be a big part of this offensive game plan going into this week, going over the middle. If Hairston's back, he's gonna have a tough go with Trey Harris, but I think that's an area that you're not really looking to exploit if you're Ole Miss in this offense. But ultimately, when you look at the Ole Miss pass catching weapons versus Kentucky's defensive backs, I give the advantage to Ole Miss, and I do think that there is a possibility that Ole Miss wins over the top, and maybe not so much in the run game. I think running against Kentucky's defense is going to be really tough, but I like Ole Miss in their offense in this game. I just think that more is going to be placed on Jackson Dart than on Parrish in this rushing attack, more so than it has in previous games.
Let's talk about the defense for just a second for Ole Miss and I say just a second, and I really mean it because honestly, there's not a lot of questions on this Ole Miss defense at this point. Now, like I said, we saw a couple of explosive plays for Kentucky towards the end of that football game. That fourth down play, I mean, when Barry and Brown caught what was it, a 40-something yard pass there along the sidelines on 4th and 3. I mean, who was expecting that? The cojones to be able to call that play. I mean, I wasn't expecting it. Surprised me. So I won't hold that against Ole Miss too much there. But look at these stats. I mean, there's only one thing on this page that you can really point to, and that's pass yards per game allowed. And I really don't even like pointing to that in this situation because Ole Miss has been up in so many football games this season because they haven't played anybody up until last week that every other team had no choice but to throw the football. They had absolutely no choice when you get behind quick, like you do, Ole Miss in this offense, and when you're a lesser talented team, they put up points quick, and then you're behind, and you feel like you've got to throw the ball. So take that with a grain of salt. Look how good they've been on third down, fourth in the country, 22.5%. I mean that is, and that carried over to the Kentucky game. Kentucky wasn't amazing on third down. 18 sacks gained. This team doesn't only you know play good uniform defense; they create havoc. They've created some turnovers, 7 total this season. 4 of them, I believe, were interceptions. The other 3 fumbles. So secondary's been able to at least turn the ball over some. Even though they've given up some yards, I like this defense. Pete Golding has aged like a fine wine at Ole Miss. Honestly, he was kind of kicked to the side there by Alabama, or was going to be kind of kicked to the side, and Alabama fans were ready to run him out of town on the first thing smoking. And he ends up at Ole Miss, and for all intents and purposes, looks like he's got the defense, lined up where they need to be. They know their assignments, and looks pretty organized. This is a complex defense that Pete Golden runs, and I think it takes really high end players. And for the most part, I think Ole Miss, has went into the transfer portal and been able to go and get some of those high end players. That's translated to some good numbers defensively this season. What do you think about the Ole Miss defense?
Yeah, I really like Chris Paul in the middle of the defense and what he's been able to do. And then, you talk about Pete Golden coming over from Alabama, getting Trey Amos to come over from Alabama was a big addition to this defense. He did get a couple of PIs called in the game against Kentucky, but
Yeah.
I don't think that I don't think any less of Trey Amos in this football game. I think he's going to be ready to play this week. I think he's still their best DB, potentially their best player on defense, just in general. But yeah, I mean, when you look at the defense and what they brought in along the defensive line, with Princely Umanmielen,
Princely
coming in
U.
over, Princely U coming over from Florida, and I mean just the pieces overall that they've been able to bring in. I do think that they have really kind of meshed together really well overall, and I think it's kind of been a surprise. We wonder about this experiment with Ole Miss. Can you bring in transfer portal players? Can they gel together, specifically on defense, specifically in the back end of the defense? So far, they've done a pretty good job of that, and it really starts up front with the strong defensive line. You can see their tackles for loss, 53 on the season. Holy cow! Like that's incredible. Through just a few games so far this year, I think that against this South Carolina offensive line, I think that they're going to eat. It's going to be pretty tough sledding for the South Carolina offense to get going. I think that this is kind of the game, because as good as Ole Miss's defense has been, nobody's talking about them. Nobody's talking about them like they're talking about Tennessee and how much more improved they are, and Miami and how much more improved they are. Well, Ole Miss has equally been improved as some of those
Yeah.
other teams in the country, and I think that this could be a game where we look at. I think real college football fans are going to watch this game and say, yeah, Ole Miss, their defense is for real, and they came to play. Now that they've got to play with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder after losing to Kentucky. If you want to make the playoffs with Ole Miss's schedule, which is pretty light, there's no more room for error, because you got Georgia coming later in the season, and that's going to be a tough matchup. You don't necessarily have to win that game against Georgia if you can win the rest of these games. But it starts with South Carolina this week. I like Ole Miss's defense in this matchup.
Yeah. Let's talk about South Carolina here and what they're going to bring to the table offensively. It looks like Lenora Sellers is going to be back for this football game. From everything I heard, he was ready to go back in against Akron this past week, and they held him out for good reason. You didn't need him against Akron, obviously. Robbie Ashford did his thing and had a nice day, and South Carolina took care of them, no problem. Um, with him coming back, I felt like before he left, we were starting to see some progress for this South Carolina offense. And I agree with you on the offensive line part of this matchup. I think this is a really, really tough matchup and a tough ask of this offensive line that started off the season really, 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 really rough. Um, 16 sacks allowed. That's good for 126 in the country. You know, for a team like Ole Miss, who's top 5 in the country in sacks, you got to sit there and scratch your head and say, all right, is South Carolina going to be able to protect and develop anything in the passing game in this football game? We'll see. I mean, that's a big question for me, and I think a big reason why this line is over a touchdown. 4.16 yards per rush this season. Rocket Sanders has been a big part of that. 57 carries, 286 yards. He's averaging 5 yards a rush this season. Honestly, he's played a whole lot better than what I anticipated that he would in the preseason. To be honest with you, we felt like at the end of the season last year at Arkansas, he just seemed really slow, and I think he was just a bit demoralized, after such a bad offensive line that he was running behind. This one at South Carolina is better than the one in Arkansas last year, hands down. And Rocket Sanders is doing his best to take advantage of it. Nick Harbor, a guy that everybody's been itching to see Olympic speed from this guy. He's got 4 catches, 35 yards this season, no touchdowns, 1 rush for 1 yard, no touchdowns. I don't know if we're ever going to see Nick Harbor at it 100, like fully developed into this game. I don't know when that's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And this offense really, really needs him, man. I mean, really, really need this guy to step up. Your 2 leading receivers here, Bennett, who's got 11 receptions for 159 yards, a couple of touchdowns, and then Jared Brown there, 7 receptions, 98 yards. Just not a whole lot of production there in the wide receiver room. Simon from tight end provides a little bit of help there, as well as Smith. They got 12 catches combined for about 130 yards or so put together, 1 touchdown. There just hasn't been a lot of production offensively through the air for this team. Lenora Sellers likes to run the football a little bit. They're going to definitely try to establish the run with Rocket Sanders. I'm a little bit frightened by the fact, that they're about to go against a really, really good Ole Miss defense here. I'm a little bit suspect of this offense in this spot. What do you think?
I completely agree. There's just a lack of weapons. You know, when
Yeah.
when your quarterback running the football is your scariest aspect on offense, that's concerning when you're going against the defense that we just hyped up for Ole Miss. And I don't. Although Rocket Sanders has been okay, he's still only averaging 5 yards a carry. I mean, that's not like world beating. That's probably not top half in the SEC for starting running backs. Um, I'm concerned when it comes to the weapons on offense for South Carolina. Most of their production has come on the defensive side of the football and what they've been able to do in creating short fields basically through their defensive play and their special teams. But the offense is leaving a lot to be desired. Now, Lenora Sellers coming back, I think, does help because we saw him getting better and better as weeks went on, and then he goes out. And look, I mean, Robbie Ashford has played pretty well, but most of his effectiveness has been with his legs. I think that South Carolina will have a little bit of a tough road if they're trying to run the football, whether it's with their quarterbacks or with their running backs in this football game. We did see Kentucky do it pretty effectively, but I think Kentucky's better on the offensive line than South Carolina at this point in the season. I don't like this matchup for South Carolina, but it is a home game. Maybe that gives them a little bit of some juice, but I'm not favoring this matchup for South Carolina.
Well, let's talk about the strength of this South Carolina team, which is the defense, and specifically the defensive line. It's been a godsend, Dylan Stewart, this season. The freshman there, top right of those 4 pictures, number 6. 6'6", 248 pounds. And look, some of these stats I actually did not update all the way, so that's my bad, guys. So some of these tackles and things like that that was a couple of games ago when we broke South Carolina down. But Kyle Kennard coming over from Georgia Tech, he's had an unbelievable season this year. These ends for this South Carolina defense are just game breakers. Dylan Stewart, while there is some film out on this guy now and people know a little bit more about what they're dealing with, I am worried about Ole Miss's offensive line against these guys. Like Dylan
Yes.
Stewart flashes he's an NFL first round pick if I've ever seen one. The speed rush is unbelievable. He'll just straight up bum rush your ass, and then the very next play you'll go out to block him, and he's already around you. I mean, he's just unbelievably athletic. Kyle Kennard brings more of that experience to this defense and the defensive line. Tonka Hemingway, DeAndre Jules, a couple of really good guys there in the middle that can plug it up. This team has been pretty good against the rush this year. 28th in the country, 104 yards per game allowed, 3.13 yards per rush allowed. That's good for 29th. So top 30 in the country, pretty much every metric you want to look at as far as stopping the run. And that's kind of feeds into what I talked about with Ole Miss and their offense. They have trouble running the football, and I compared them to Georgia. Georgia's having trouble running the football. Not a ton of great running backs in those running back rooms right now. Not a super physical offensive line. I'm worried about Ole Miss's ability to match up with this defensive line, and I think that it's going to cause some serious issues for Ole Miss. Now, 1 for 10 last week on third down for Ole Miss, and I don't know exactly what their average yards was to go on that third down, but I know they were behind the chains. They were behind the chains every time they had a third down, just about. So that's gonna be is getting ahead of this defense on first and second down. Ole Miss has got to figure out a way to run the football a little bit. South Carolina has, I think, the upper hand here as far as that goes. What do you think about this defensive line? It's been one that we've talked about a couple of times this year, and they just haven't disappointed. 14 sacks, that's 16th in the country. 28 tackles for loss, that's 50th in the country. Pretty much every metric you want to look at, man, this is a really, really good group, and probably one of the biggest surprises of the SEC, in my opinion, this year.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, when you look at the defensive line specifically for South Carolina, I think that they're probably top three in the SEC right now. And really just kind of do a great job of creating havoc. Kyle Kennard, 5.5 sacks on the year so far. He's coming at you on one end, then Dylan Stewart coming at you on the other end. Imanwari, has done his thing so far. I really like the defense for South Carolina. I don't question the defensive line at all, and I think that the with as disruptive as this defensive line has been for South Carolina, it makes everything easier on the back end of their defense. I'm just concerned that it's not going to be enough against Ole Miss. This is not Kentucky's offense. I understand that when you look at what Kentucky did last week against Ole Miss and they beat Ole Miss, and then you say, well, South Carolina beat Kentucky handedly at home. South Carolina should win this game. Well, we know that college football doesn't really work that way. It's more so about the matchups. I just don't feel like South Carolina is going to win in the matchups in this game. But I do like their defense. I don't think that Ole Miss is about to come in and hang 50 on South Carolina or anything like that. But let's not fool ourselves in thinking that just because South Carolina beat Kentucky and Kentucky beat Ole Miss, that means South Carolina is going to beat Ole Miss. That's not how it works. I think you see a much different team for Ole Miss come through this week, and I really like the defense for South Carolina, but like I said, I just feel like they're a little bit overmatched here with Ole Miss.
Let's talk about this secondary because this is another strength for this defense. This secondary is really, really good, and I'm interested to see how they match up in this football game with Ole Miss and all those great wide receivers that we mentioned there at the top of the video. Um, Nick Emanwari, really, really good player there at safety. DQ Smith playing on the other side of him. That's your strong and free safety there. And Jalen Kilgore is somebody that is just plays really high level football there at the nickelback position. One of the cornerback spots, you kind of got, you know, I guess kind of by committee approach going on there. But O'Donnell Fortune is playing one of the other cornerback spots. I really like him. Vakari Swain, Judge Collier, those guys are kind of figuring out who's going to play that other side of that corner spot. But look, I really like the secondary for South Carolina, and I'm not putting it past them to get a couple of turnovers. 6
Yes.
interceptions so far in 2024. That's good for 18th in the country, top 20 in the country at turning the ball over as a secondary. So, 5.1 average yards per attempt allowed there passing. That's good for ninth in the country. 163.8 pass yards per game allowed. That's 23rd in the country. But the sad, I look back to the LSU game, right? The secondary played really, I thought, pretty well in that LSU game against a little bit hampered of a wide receiver room there for LSU. And I'm not saying that LSU's wide receiver room is necessarily comparable to Ole Miss's, but um, they got a couple of playmakers for sure. I thought the secondary played pretty well for the most part there. And I think they've got a chance to, change the game this weekend. This is a group right here. The defensive line is obviously going to need to add some pressure. We've seen teams be able to do that against Ole Miss this season. Bad teams. We've seen bad teams be able to provide pressure on Ole Miss this season. Maybe it rushes Jackson Dart, who feels like everything's on his shoulders this weekend. Maybe it rushes him into some decisions that he doesn't need to be making, and can provide these guys with some interceptions. Look, it's no secret. If South Carolina's going to win this football game, I don't have a ton of faith in their offense to be able to, score 30 in this one. Defense is going to have to hold in there. The recipe has got to be the same as that, that Kentucky Ole Miss game, right? It's got to be stop the run, get them in obvious passing downs, get them behind the chains, pin our ears back, and get after them. And South Carolina's got all the tools they need to do that part. We'll see what Lenora Sellers brings to this offense whenever he comes back this week. Guy's a playmaker. Dude's an absolute playmaker. I really like this secondary. Now, like I said, the wide receivers for Ole Miss are really good. So, not saying the secondary necessarily has an upper hand here, but if the defensive line can provide pressure, these guys can cover for limited amounts of times for sure. What are your thoughts, kind of finishing up the defense there for South Carolina, and then you want to take us into your prediction?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the secondary for South Carolina, I do really like really the whole South Carolina defense as a whole. I just feel like the Ole Miss pass catching weapons are the best that South Carolina has seen so far this year, and if Ole Miss can stop the pass rush of South Carolina to some degree, you're not gonna stop them the entire game. You're just not. But if you can get some protection there for Jackson Dart, I think he can pick you apart there. But look, I mean, I do think that obviously playing this game at South Carolina in Columbia, it makes a huge difference. I don't like Ole Miss to cover. 9 points is too many points. I think that South Carolina is going to be able to keep this within a touchdown, but obviously I'm picking Ole Miss to win the football game. I think that the under is probably the play here in this football game. 52.5 just seems like a lot of points when South Carolina is struggling to score right now, and both defenses are playing really, really well. Give me South Carolina to cover. Ole Miss wins the game, and also I think maybe as a best bet on Thursday when we do that show, I'm probably going to play the under in this game as well.
Did you say Ole Miss to cover or South Carolina?
I meant to say South Carolina. I don't know what I
I
said,
think you
but
did. I think you did. I was just
okay.
making sure I heard that right.
I like South Carolina to cover the points. I think Ole Miss wins by about 6.
Okay. I'm pretty close with you on that. I'm not betting this one with this isn't a best bet for the week or anything. We do a Thursday best bet show every week. Come and join us. It's called Between the Lines. We have a great time there. This isn't going to be one of mine on that show this week. I can tell you that. Um, Look, I think Ole Miss covers the spread, but I think they barely cover this the spread. I think it's like 27-17. I think that they just barely get over that 9 point threshold there. 10 is a pretty common number as far as betting goes, but beyond the whole betting aspect of it, I feel like South Carolina's got all the tools necessary to disrupt this Ole Miss team. And this is on the road, and this is going to be one hell of an atmosphere here. I would not be surprised at all if South Carolina figures out a way to win this football game. It would not surprise me at all. I'm going to have my eyes glued to it. Um, it's going to depend on the South Carolina defense being able to get a couple of turnovers in this football game. That's really what it's going to boil down to me. Get pressure on Jackson Dart. He's going to be an obvious passing downs. I don't have faith in this Ole Miss team to be able to run the football here. Made that very clear on this video. Um, you're going to have Ole Miss in obvious passing downs, and it's going to be one-on-one. And I like the secondary for South Carolina. If they can create a couple of turnovers, I think South Carolina can win this game. But I'm with you, Mason, on the under. Maybe the under is something that I consider betting this week because I don't think this is going to be a very high-scoring game. Although, pretty close there, I guess. I said 27-17, so maybe I shouldn't. But
44,
52 and a half,
I mean,
I think the most likely outcome is under on that one. As I don't see South Carolina being able to muster up a lot of points here, and really Ole Miss for that matter either. So give me the under in this one. I think that's the best bet.